Good morning, afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I am Aishwarya Sankar, Senior Analyst and CBRT Coordinator at Climate Bonds, and today I'm very excited to be moderating our discussion today with three set of amazing panelists. Before we begin, I do want to acknowledge that we have participants slowly joining us from across the globe, from different time zones, contexts, and their different perspectives on water infrastructure sector. So thank you to everyone who has joined the session today. So, after extensive technical development, the updated water infrastructure criteria are actually now open for a 60-day public consultation period. And this is actually your opportunity, whether you're an investor, issuer, engineer, water utility, or a development bank, or even a researcher, to provide us the feedback that will shape the final criteria. And this is a chance during the webinar as well. So, the water infrastructure actually sits at the intersection of two of the most important and pressing challenges of our time. One is the climate change and sustainable development. Because on one hand, water systems are among the most vulnerable to climate impacts such as droughts, floods, changing precipitation patterns, and temperature extremes. But on the other hand, water infrastructure is also essential for climate adaptation and resilience that protects communities, supports agriculture, maintains ecosystem wider systems, and also enables economic development. So, in essence, water infrastructure sector is a very close cross-cutting and relevant in various other sectors as well. So, the financial scale of the sector is actually staggering. Global investments in water infrastructure is estimated to around 1 to 2 trillion USD annually, but much of this infrastructure was actually designed for climate conditions that actually no longer exist today. So, as we look ahead, we need to ensure that every dollar invested not only provides water services today, doesn't just cater to what's happening today, but also builds resilience for an uncertain climate future, as we can see where the world is moving now. So, before we do dive into the criteria, I also wanted to highlight something that is very prominent to this criteria update, which is the inclusion of methane emissions for the water infrastructure. So this has been added to the criteria under the Global Methane Project that we're doing as part of Climate Bond's broader effort to expand credible science-based guidance for methane mitigation across sectors. So why methane? Methane has around a global warming potential of 21 times much higher than CO2. We all know CO2, we understand what it means for CO2, and our heart when we talk about mitigation has always been with CO2. But methane is actually as much as important, and the potential is much higher. So it's important to also understand what methane is. And when we talk about methane in the water infrastructure, we predominantly talk about the wastewater collection and the treatment because they are the most significant sources, especially from anaerobic conditions in our sewer systems, for example, to treatment processes. So, what makes this important from an investment perspective is that it's also one of the most cost effective mitigation opportunities. What I mean by that is the UN Environment Program recently estimated that wastewater has around 5 times more energy potential than what's needed today to treat it, meaning the biogas capture, the resource recovery can actually turn treatment plants from energy consumers to energy producers. So the criteria addresses this through energy efficiency thresholds for conventional treatment, methane monitoring requirements for nature-based systems as well as hybrid systems, and cross-references to our waste management criteria for sludge treatment, which is also currently under public consultation. So this ensures that the water infrastructure bonds aren't just building climate resilience, but are also avoiding significant greenhouse emissions via the do no significant harm aspect, including CO2 and methane emissions. So this is where the Climate Bonds water infrastructure criteria actually comes in. These criteria provide a framework for water infrastructure investments, identifying their investments that are genuinely climate resilient, that avoids maladaptation. We will be talking more in depth about what we mean by maladaptation, in particular with respect to the water infrastructure sector, and that does not do any significant harm to our climate and other environmental objectives. What makes these criteria unique is the comprehensiveness, how we have covered an entire ranging from built infrastructure and nature-based solutions as well as hybrid approaches where possible, including climate adaptation and resilience and the mitigation objectives, and everything right from monitoring systems to how the desalination works, as well as until the ecological restoration. So we will also be looking at this at more of a systems level approach. So we will be looking at in terms of both large scale municipal systems as well as community level interactions. But probably rather than me telling you about all this, I'm joined today by two experts. First, John Matthews, who has been working as a resilience scientist and practitioner since 2013 to mobilize water resources for more effective and durable climate action and policy. John actually co founded the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation, the very first organization globally to bind these water and climate into a common agenda. His work has led to the development of a variety of climate risk reduction methodologies that's used in dozens of countries, as well as he is also very important and pertinent in preparing the climate bonds criteria, the very first water criteria being developed back in 2016. And we have also already certified around 40 billion USDs in the water resilience investments across 6 continents. And he has also advised over 100 countries on their national climate commitments. And next, we have Paul Fleming, who works at the intersection of the water, climate resilience, and value creation. He is the founder of Water Value LLC, where he advises startups, scale ups, investors, and NGOs in operating water and climate tech space. Previously, he created and led Microsoft's Global Water Program, establishing the company's industry leading 2030 water positive commitments and developing its global water strategy. Paul also serves as the president of the Climate and Water Initiative, and he's also the board member of the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation. And more importantly, he has also supported in this current development. And finally, we also have with us my lovely colleague, Matteo Biconi, who is our head of taxonomies. Having previously worked at Climate Bonds as head of certifications, he has worked with a lot of stakeholders, including investors, issuers, verifiers, financial institutions. So he is a very, very prominent part of what we do, including also developing national taxonomies across the globe. So please make sure to use the chat function to ask us any questions. We will definitely aim to answer them all towards the end of the session. We will be allowing around 10 to 15 minutes to answer any of the burning questions we have. So with that, let's begin. Matteo, probably I would like to start with you and ask you about the foundation of the work itself. The Climate Bonds Resilience Taxonomy, or the CBRT, is relatively new for many people. And I know you have been a very important part of it in developing it, as well as also talking about that to other different various users and stakeholders. Can you please explain in simple terms, what is the CBRT? Why did we develop it? And more importantly, what problem are we trying to solve with this?
Yeah, thank you very much, Ashwarya, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Matteo, I'm head of taxonomy, as Ashwarya mentioned, and I am leading the development of the Climate Bonds Resilience Taxonomy. And basically, the taxonomy came to be because, as you know, the Paris Agreement encourages the capital flows towards climate finance, so green finance. And historically, it's always been more tilted towards mitigation because of the urgency of addressing the climate emergency. But obviously, the Paris Agreement says that we need to invest equally into mitigation and adaptation and resilience. Historically, the flows of capital into adaptation and resilience have been a lot lower than mitigation. And so we really set out to correct that deficiency and make sure that there's more climate finance funneled towards adaptation and resilience finance. And by talking to investors, we realized that one of the main obstacles to this was the lack of definitions, clear definitions as to what adaptation and resilience investments might look like. And obviously, being head of taxonomies and working in taxonomies with the wider climate bonds team, we set out to develop a resilience taxonomy that could provide granular descriptions on what adaptation and resilience investment would be that could go beyond the activity. So we included investments level at the measure level. So very specific granular descriptions of investments that can be measured, so CapEx and OpEx investments that go beyond the overarching activity level. And so in a way, we wanted to go a lot more granular in the description and provide clarity to both investors, policymakers, and green bond issuers as to what use of proceeds to include in bonds or investments tools in general when we talk about adaptation and resilience. So that was one part of it. The second part of it was also to, in a way, come up with consensus as to what adaptation and resilience would be, potentially also including specific thresholds, either at the regional, asset level, or global level. So typically, adaptation and resilience is highly localized. And so what represents substantial contribution for one activity in, say, South America or Brazil or the north of Brazil even, might not have adaptation and resilience substantial contribution in other parts of the world. So we wanted to test that hypothesis, so threshold-based or a threshold-based approach, and see if we could find consensus with the wider adaptation and resilience community into that.
Great. Thanks, Matteo. So I understand that there has always been a lack of definition, picking up from what you said, what it exactly means for significant contribution to adaptation and resilience looks like to give that investor the confidence. So following that, can I then ask you, water infrastructure is actually one of our 7 themes that we have identified in the CBRT alongside resilient cities, agri-food health system, and others. Can you please explain why we started with the water infrastructure criteria and what makes the water infrastructure uniquely important for climate resilience?
Sure. Several reasons. First of all, because we had criteria in water criteria, water infrastructure criteria within the climate bond standards and the certification scheme. And so we really didn't want to reinvent the wheel, but really pick those criteria up and see how they could be integrated in the CBRT directly, and see what updates we needed to provide in order to integrate the criteria into the wider taxonomy. Secondly, because obviously a big portion of green bonds are actually water bonds. So roughly around 11% of the total green bonds in the world are water bonds. So there's a relatively large demand for it. It does change within regions. So for instance, in the Middle East and North Africa region is around 36%. And so that's obviously because water is particularly important, scarcity of water rather, is particularly acute there. But also in places like the UK, it represents 19% of all corporate bonds, corporate green bonds. So there's a lot of space for development for water and demand for water bonds. Also, water is adaptation and resilience historically. So it's really the stereotypical clear adaptation and resilience theme that we have. Not only that, but it's also transversal. So it undercuts a lot of different themes. It should not be seen as siloed or be thought in isolation, but rather one of those critical transversal themes that cuts across different sectors of the economy and different sectors of our lives, really. So we thought it was a very clear, critical sector to start with because of the demand of green bonds and from the market, the critical aspect of it, because it undercuts all the different aspects of society and there's a lot of demand for it, but also because it is traditionally tilted towards adaptation and resilience. So we thought it was a low-hanging fruits.
Thanks, Matteo. Yes, I think, as you said, water infrastructure has predominantly always been adaptation and resilience. And also, I think it also touches on the point of what you meant by highly localized. How are we localizing the CBRT? So I think water infrastructure is one of the best examples of how we are pertaining it to that specific sector. So following that, can I please ask you from, let's say, from an investor or an issuer perspective, or even a taxonomy developer perspective, how would they actually use the CBRT and these criteria that we are developing together as we also start to roll out other sector criteria for resilience?
Yeah, sure. So a preamble to all of this is that obviously our work is integrated into the wider development of the climate bonds resilience taxonomy. The initial version of the taxonomy is always meant to be interim. So the criteria that we have are interim at the moment. And so the work that we did with John and Paul and the rest of the TWG, the technical working group, and the IWG, the industry working group, is basically populating the climate bonds resilience taxonomy and checking the current version or the previous version of the criteria. And those criteria, together with the measures and investments, are really basically what green bond issuers, policymakers, and investors can understand as use of proceeds. So really investment into water infrastructure. So for instance, if you're a green bond issuer, you can use a taxonomy to select the underlying project and assets to include in a bond to refinance or finance water infrastructure. If you're a policymaker, you can devise really incentives for water infrastructure, for water products. And also, if you're an investor, it really clarifies to you what's eligible, what provides substantial contribution to water, what are the risks for do no significant harm and the risks of maladaptation. So it really provides a little bit of all-encompassing and thorough understanding of the water sector from a green finance perspective. So what qualifies as investment into water. And it also provides the framework, the theoretical framework for the selection of project and assets.
Thanks, Matteo. I think that was a really good introduction to what we're doing for the CBRT and why we have started with the water infrastructure. So maybe let's move on to John and Paul, but Matteo, I will come back to you with more questions as and when we go through the webinar. So let's move on to and take a deep dive on what we have done with the water infrastructure criteria itself. So starting that, John, probably perhaps my first question is to you. You and Paul have been working on water and climate for decades now. So these criteria did not emerge in a vacuum. We do know that because it does predate to around 2016 when you initially started building this. So can you walk us through what was the starting philosophy and what core principles did you and the technical working group establish from day one, also building from what Matteo did talk about the CBRT, the Climate Bonds Resilience Taxonomy work that we did. So we are indeed building from that. Over to you, John.
Yeah, thank you, Aishwarya. And I'm definitely going to be building on some of the comments that Matteo made as well. I think it's important to understand that a lot has happened since 2016. When we started the process originally a decade ago, we were much more focused on the water sector. And by water sector, what I really mean are the investments around how we treat, how we store, how we transport water. We also added as a component of that how we manage some types of water hazards, so things like flood defenses. The At the time in 2016, the framework that we really used, it was definitely the state of the art, maybe a little bit past the state of the art, but it was primarily a risk framework. The word resilience actually was not really being used in the climate adaptation community at all at the time. Even in the COP process, resilience was not a term of art. It wasn't in the IPCC. It was something else. Risk was our primary focus. That said, there were special problems that we tried to acknowledge around water and climate and within that risk framework. And those were that water is actually unlike many other types of climate impacts, such as air temperature. It's actually very difficult technically to be able to predict with confidence what water conditions in the future will look like. The World Bank has referred to this as the problem of deep uncertainty and has been kind of tracking and addressing this for something like 15 years already. So we needed to make sure that we were kind of capturing this broader set of insights. I think what is significantly different now that in 2026, and that I think also represents a kind of prescience on the part of CBI, if I can compliment you all, is saying that we need to really not think about traditional sectors as we think about adaptation resilience. We actually need to think about resilience itself as kind of a new investment sector by itself. And water plays a really critical role in that. So in our principles, we wanted to build on the insights that we'd used a decade ago, but we also wanted to make sure that we were relevant to other areas. For instance, much clean energy use is very water intensive, but it's not in the traditional water sector. Much agriculture is incredibly water intensive, or the kind of larger food system, but water is not included. And then we have this larger change that's happening around a movement that distinguishes resilience from risk. So, in a sense, the problem that we're trying to solve is pretty complex. It's trying to say water is this transversal medium for resilience. It's not just a hazard. It's not just a risk. It's not just a sector. It actually is a way that we need to be articulating resilience in a very credible way to investors and to bond issuers across a wide range of sectors. Uh, uh, so a lot of our work with the technical working group in that sense was trying to give substance to this idea of what water and the relationship between water and resilience. And in that sense, we're trying to fall back on what I think are some deep insights that we'll probably be articulating over the rest of these questions. But I think maybe for the water community, it will sound a little more familiar, but I think it's going to be newer for some other sectors that we're engaging with. So if we have difficulty thinking about what water is going to look like in the future, then we need to think about how we approach robustness versus flexibility in our investments. We need to think about issues around the way water is allocated and shared across multiple stakeholders, multiple water users, including ecosystems. We also need to think about the governance systems that are interacting that may structure our choices around water. And lastly, we also need to think very carefully about the kind of level of effort that we put into the technical analysis. Have we the phrase that I like to use is have we struggled for our art? And I think one of the big ideas in resilience is that there's not a single optimal approach to resilience. And resilience is also something different than what we have been approaching water with really for at least a century. It's not just about water use efficiency. It's not just about trying to optimize water for a single future. It's actually saying water is really spread out over a wide range of potential futures. And maybe if we're optimizing for a single future or we're optimizing for resilience, it could actually get us into a more fragile situation.
Right. Thanks, John. I think that's really important, and especially picking on your point on a transversal element. I definitely think water infrastructure should be at the heart of it, as we've always discussed, even with our technical working group. And particularly also picking on the point that technically it's not easy to be able to predict what water conditions will be in the future might look like. So I think that's also one of the reasons that our water criteria is done in such a way. Of course, we'll be looking at in depth what we also mean by various allocations, the technical diagnostics that we've talked about. But I think, Paul, building on that, what John has mentioned to us, one of the most distinct features of our criteria is the scorecard approach that we have, which says we need a minimum of 60% threshold across all the 6 sections that we have in our scorecard. So this is actually quite different from saying your infrastructure, for example, must withstand at X meter of sea level rise or provide Y return protection, Y return period of flood protection. So why do you think the TWG rejected those kind of fixed thresholds And what's the rationale for the process-based scorecard? And more importantly, it'll also be good if we can also touch upon the transversal element that this scorecard will also work on.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of reasons we went down that path, and Matteo set that up nicely when he reiterated what is commonly understood, that water is very much a local issue, right? But it's also this case for adaptation and resilience that those are locally based decisions that drive what path really you want to take to pursue adaptation and resilience. And so this local context is essential for both understanding the water context, but also what is the best and optimal path for a community or a entity to take to pursue resilience. And it's embedded in that is that there is a risk tolerance question at the heart of that, right? And that is a question that needs to be answered based on the local values of the community that's operating there, right? There's not and it's a choice that has to be made. And so that's sort of one reason that we didn't pursue sort of a global standard, is because we wanted to really acknowledge and create space for those local choices to be made. But and it's consistent with this notion of moving from responding to climate as a risk exercise to responding to climate as a resilient exercise. Resilience is, I think, my opinion, is really about value creation, right? Not just avoiding the risk of climate change, but also charting a path forward for how you want your community, your entity to thrive in a changing climate. And that is a very, again, there are a lot of choices that are embedded in that. And so we felt that it was really important to create the space and latitude for that. And then finally, I'd say that John alluded to the deep uncertainty of projecting and understanding the future under climate change. That is another reason why assigning like something like a Y return period just doesn't seem to make much sense here, right? There's a great degree of uncertainty around, and one might even argue it's a fool's gold or fool's errand to try and predict the future under climate change. And so assigning a really precise like 25-year return period in the context of a real highly deep, uncertain space, as well as an arena where local choices need to be made about what their tolerance is and what path they want to choose to pursue resilience, were the number of factors that went in that guided us towards the approach that we took.
Great. I do hear the point that it's more of an ongoing process. It's not a one size fits all, especially given how we perceive resilience, because what might work today might not exactly work in the near future, even for the same location that we're talking about. So thank you, Paul. So building on that, let's go into a bit more detail about the scorecard that has 6 sections. So probably, John, this is happy for you to come in. So the allocation, governance, technical diagnostics, and adaptation plan. These 4 parts of the scorecard are the ones where it's necessary, important, and it's mandatory to all, regardless of what asset or activity they are. But then we also have an additional section for when it's nature-based solutions, and we also have an additional section when it desalination plans. So this is a lot of ground to cover. It's a lot. So can you walk us through what the sections are and it's what essentially they mean, and why are all these 6 sections necessary, of course, where applicable, when you look at it as a whole?
Sure, absolutely. And I think these are important points. They also go to the heart about ensuring that we have real credibility here. So to building on Paul's statement, we're focused on not the the terms of the financing agreement, we're focused on the operational lifetime of the asset itself, right? That could be decades, it could be a century. And then we're focused on, I think, two really key insights on resilience. One of them is that resilience is a process, and it's something that we hope that it's in place at the start of a project, at the start of an investment, but that it also continues over time. That we assume, because of the special qualities of water, it's going to need to see adjustments, and see some evolution, and change. And the last piece, the second reason is really that water is not just a sector, it's not just a hazard, it's also a connector. So there's a temptation to just focus on the individual asset itself, right? But when we really need to think about is, what is this asset? It's going into a whole series of other water connections, other kinds of water users and stakeholders. And those are going to change themselves over time too. So we need to make sure that as we build a new seat at the table for this particular asset, that the water is really shared more broadly. So that really explains the kind of first two aspects, the allocation, and governance arrangements. These really builds on insights from a lot of the multilateral development banks, from the OECD, from other groups, trying to understand what are the terms in which, in a particular place, that we're deciding not just how water decisions are made for that asset, but that they're made over a larger landscape of issues and policies. The second is the technical diagnostics. This is the aspect of, do you have like a hydrological model for this? Have you stress tested it? Have you begun to kind of explore the boundaries of where the asset, if some of your assumptions are wrong about what the future are, like how is the asset going to continue to function and potentially damage other areas? Nature-based solutions for water are often really critical. Water is not just something that occurs in pipes. It also it's a whole landscape. And in fact, using the original criteria, one of the I think it was at the time the largest green bond, climate bond in European history. Used our original criteria. It was about 5 billion euros from the Dutch Finance Ministry for a huge room for the river project. I mean, that's a powerful validation, right, of nature-based solutions. Mostly we're talking about very small investments. This one was at scale, and it used our criteria, recognizing that larger landscape is really critical. And then we've also added some other components, like there's a hydropower component, there's a desal component. Altogether, those aspects are really trying to look at risk, and if you've really explored the limits of resilience. At the time of 2016, that actually was incredibly edgy. I remember as we were starting that process, there had just been issued from a major, globally important water utility, a 100 million US bond that had really strong climate implications. And I actually emailed the CFO of that utility directly, and I said, you know, I looked at your memorandum of understanding for the bond issuance. We're really curious. Can I see your climate vulnerability assessment? And he emailed back within minutes. He'd never met me before, and he said, "What is that? Is that important?" And really, that checklist, it's evaluating a climate risk assessment. And at the time, 10 years ago, you couldn't assume that an issuer would have generated a vulnerability assessment. And things are different now. That is de rigueur. It is the floor that we all stand on now for these investments. So these criteria initially, like they're focused particularly on evaluating the quality, essentially, of that risk and vulnerability assessment. The last piece is to say, here's how we've identified risk. Here's how we have thought about the options for resilience. Now we're going to evaluate your adaptation plan. With the risks and threats that you've identified, have you actually taken it to the next level? Have you pushed it into the A&R space? And that we think is also a really an important element. Not only have you seen the risk, but you've acted on it. And I think for issuers, actually that's an important part of effectively their audience. They're communicating to investors, maybe to other kinds of stakeholders too. We see that there's a problem, and we're acting on it, and we're acting with foresight and momentum.
Right. Thanks, John. I think you've touched on a really important point, saying we need to act on it, because that's what we essentially mean by significant contribution to adaptation and resilience. It's not just them doing a couple of bunch of tests or just working on an impact assessment, but rather they have to make sure that they have the measures in place to mitigate the risks that they've identified. And I think the scorecard, all the 6 sections are very important, because it cannot be the case where they do one and they forget about the rest of the other 5 sections. So it's also at the systems level, because again, as you have been stressing, water infrastructure is definitely more at the systems level, and the importance of it is at the systems level. So that's where the allocation, governance, everything comes into play. So they need to make sure that they don't skip any of these 6 prominent sections that have been well thought through, well recognized, and also well put into space, to make sure it also is easy for the users to pick it up more like a checklist and just do an easier assessment towards it. So, okay, so maybe following on that, I do have a question regarding the scorecard approach, which is more of the process-based approach. Again, just to highlight, even though it's a process-based approach, we do say that everybody needs to score a minimum of 60% in each of the sections, regardless of what asset or activity they're looking at. So while this process-based philosophy does align with the frameworks like the EU taxonomy, MDB approaches, I think the scorecard is far more detailed than the more general requirements to conduct any climate risk assessment. You did touch upon that in the previous question as well. But why do you think we came out, or we arrived at this conclusion, including also various conversations we had with the technical working group, that this level of detail was necessary? Like, what gaps are we exactly looking to fill by this approach? Are we also talking about this is what it means to significantly contribute to resilience and adaptation?
Is that directed to
John
Paul?
or Paul, both of you, if you would like to come in with each of your thinking and the way we process during the working group, it'll also be helpful.
Yeah, why don't you
Go
jump in, Paul?
ahead, John, and I'll follow up.
Okay. It's a really good question, and I have to say, as we were engaging with particularly the industry working group, we were a little bit nervous about this issue. I would like to think that Paul and I are well connected to both the climate and water communities. But we didn't really know many of the people that were actually on the industry working group, and they're a potentially very harsh audience, right? These are people that are very involved in scoring or issuing. Or that they're interested in issuing. Some of them have a billions US already kind of under their belts that they have helped facilitate in the issuance of. And one of the big points that we tried to raise with them was, do the criteria capture the complexity of water, and especially under dynamic climate? And also, do you see that there's this kind of relevant role about the connective aspects of water across other sectors? We use data centers and agriculture, particularly such as for irrigation, as 2 of the examples in that case. And I know Paul and I were kind of holding our breath when we asked that question to the industry working group, and there was this moment of silence, and I would summarize the kind of initial response was damn straight. Like absolutely, we need to really open this up. We need the water sector is important. It's really critical. I mean, I think it's already been mentioned that something like 11% of the climate bond space is already in the water sector. But what we're really saying is it's not really 11%. It's probably like 70% that this criteria is relevant to. And that's a big change. But they all recognized that there was something really important and an opportunity here to not just get water right, is really to get resilience right.
If I can come in, I'd say that I think another reason we ended up in this approach, it harkens back to the notion of water being the local context of water and adaptation and resilience being critical. If there was a global standard, I think we could have taken a less detailed approach. But because of that lack of a global standard, I think you need to have a more detailed approach to sort of tease out the local storyline of what's the context in which this bond is being issued. Just to go back to the allocation and governance issues, um, but those are systems that can constrain and hinder adaptation or resilience, or they can hasten it, right? And so understanding that, understanding the systems in which your infrastructure investments are being made is essential, right? Allocation decisions around water that are calendar based are not well suited to a changing hydrological cycle, right? And so understanding that and knowing that is essential to having some confidence that the infrastructure decisions that are being made are are representative and reflect those constraining or enabling factors. So again, I think it's critical to have this level of detail for the investor and purchasers, so to speak, of the bonds to know that it's this local context, these broader systems in which these investments are being made have been reflected and taken into account.
Absolutely. I do agree that a granular approach is what makes our criteria more unique, and it also caters to the local context. So probably we have been talking about the adaptation and resilience aspect of it for quite some time. So maybe I would like to move to the do no significant harm to mitigation, which is also, again, one of our very important stands that we have taken. So, for example, let's say desalination has a specific threshold of 100 grams CO2 equivalents per kilowatt hour energy intensity threshold, again, following from the EU taxonomy. But many might argue this is ambitious. Some might also argue saying it might exclude viable projects that are predominantly in water-stressed regions. And I think one more additionally, I would also like to add something that again, I think where we might generate some consultation feedback is the special consideration for water supply and sanitation in low income countries. So, with the idea that basic wash might warrant some flexibility on these mitigation requirements that we have, including the CO2 emissions as well as methane requirements. So, I think this is a classic development tension, climate tension, which we did go through the TWG and the IWG. We did have a very prolonged conversation on how do we want to tackle this. So I do want to ask what would be our final position, and should there be mitigation exemptions, or can the audience expect mitigation exemptions for these basic services, especially in underserved context? Paul, John, I would love to hear from both of you on this point.
Yeah, we did have a robust discussion, and I'd say it was harmonious, really, in that both the IWG and the TWG both felt that there should be an exemption. You know, I used the somewhat colorful language that the human right to safe and reliable water services should not be sacrificed on the altar of mitigation, right? And that's not to say that there should not be efforts to manage mitigation and emissions in particular, but that we have a global access problem challenge, right? And not only that, I'd also add that particularly in lower and some middle income countries, there's a massive resilience challenge as well. And so we've also discussed that the notion of that exemption being applied to these resilience investments that are necessary in order to maintain livelihoods, public health and safety, and functioning economies. So we felt really strongly about that, and do believe that there should be an exemption for these types of investments. John, do you want to come in with some additional thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, that was very, very well said. I also like the idea of being robustly colorful. Um, uh, the This point of tension between adaptation, resilience, and climate mitigation, between water and carbon, I think is actually going to be an increasingly important issue in many contexts. We can't say that the balance that we pick today is the balance that we should have universally, or even for the criteria forever. It's our best guess right now. So we're trying to be pragmatic here, and we're trying to be pragmatic on the side that there needs to be a huge amount of additional investment that goes into the wash space, especially middle and lower income countries. And we want to accelerate that. We may have to burn some carbon to actually make these economies, these communities, even these ecosystems healthier and more resilient in the long run. And given that most of the carbon has come from countries like mine, I think it's worth burning it. I'm willing to burn less so that they have healthier families. On the other side, desal, these are large investments, and they tend to lock in a lot of carbon, potentially if they choose like a carbon intensive energy source. So how can we make sure that we're not actually continuing to keep our foot really hard on the accelerator for these? And they're incredibly important. The attacks, for instance, in the Persian Gulf with the Iran war right now, many of the missiles have actually focused on both sides, have focused on desal plants, and that underscores just the importance of these for how we even imagine cities and economies in this region, that they are so dependent on water. We need to make sure that we get those facilities right, and hopefully we're doing that with a smaller carbon footprint over time. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, John. Thanks, Paul. I think that's the trade-off that we are talking about. Trade-off that is really important, because at one point it's important to have access to this, where a large amount of countries do lack that access. So I don't think we can actually be looking at when they don't have the basic right. I don't think we should be also looking at from the point of mitigation, the point of saying you need to reduce your emissions. So completely agree on that. So I have a last question for you, both of you, on the maladaptation side. We spoke about mitigation, we spoke about adaptation, resilience as a whole, but I think maladaptation is that the actions that inadvertently increase the vulnerability. And it's a concept that everyone does agree it's bad. But I think what they are missing is how to define it, what to do. So, and because there's also a fine line between mitigation and maladaptation. So I know we have embedded maladaptation prevention throughout the scorecard, because again, essentially that's how our scorecard is designed. We are also looking at it from a systems perspective. So the wider systems perspective is important for us. So throughout the scorecard, we do have maladaptation prevention embedded in it. But can you give us like a quick concrete example of what a maladaptive water project might essentially look like, and how does our criteria catch it?
I'll jump in and Paul can maybe correct me. I think one of the changes that we see between 2016 and 2026 in the criteria is that we actually adjusted a lot of our language on the scorecard from basins to systems. That's like a central insight from resilience theory, from the resilience movement, and it recognizes that we move water around a lot. And we move water directly through pipes and pumps, but we also move water indirectly through energy, through food, through many different kinds of manufacturing, trade. And we actually need to think at that higher level right now. And like a really clear example of that to me is 70% of the water in Beijing, one of the largest cities in the world, actually comes from the Yangtze River, over 1,000 kilometers away, that's pumped across mountain ranges, across several basins. It's literally pumped underneath the Yellow River in order to get to Beijing. That's a system, right? And we need to recognize that simply thinking about a traditional watershed, a traditional a basin is in many cases not relevant anymore, and we need to think at this system level because now changes that happen in Beijing are going to affect Shanghai. Uh, they're going to affect many of the communities that are along the Yangtze, and so we try to make sure that the criteria really reflect that insight that we have these sensitive relationships, that they're dynamic, that they're going to continue to be dynamic, maybe even increasingly dynamic over time. And so we want to make sure that that Paul used or I think it was Paul or Aishwarya used the great word trade-offs. We need to make sure that those trade-offs continue, right, and that they continue with wisdom as we move forward.
Yeah, I might just give a more detailed example. Let's say you have a water system that is heavily dependent upon mountain-based snowpack systems, and you have reservoirs, and you decide that your approach to sort of respond to climate change is to expand your storage system in that mountain-based system. That could well be a legitimate response. But it may also be an example where you're doubling down and on a set of conditions that are increasingly no longer going to be experienced in the future, and and lead you down a maladaptive path. Whereas stepping back and saying we're going to diversify our supply portfolio to add maybe non-snowfall dependent sources of supply or non-rainfall dependent sources of supply, or add in some groundwater. That may be a more robust path that introduces greater diversity into your supply portfolio and sort of takes you out of a singular optimized path that may no longer be all that viable in the future.
This is a great example, Paul.
Yeah. I was going to say, thank you, John. Thank you, Paul, for that detailed example. I think that does help the audience understand what exactly we mean by maladaptation and where we draw the line within our criteria. I know we are almost out of time, and I do want to take a couple of questions from the audience. But before that, back to you, Matteo. I just had one final question before we opened it for Q&A. So as we are moving into this public consultation phase, and we will be launching the criteria for market use in May, would you like to give us a quick peek of what's next for CBRT and what people can expect?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Aishwarya. So the CBRT technically is split between the methodological approach and the framework on one side, and then the governing framework, I would say, and then the other side, the other end, is the actual taxonomy. So the investments and the criteria in what is now a spreadsheet. So in terms of the framework, we are going to publish an updated version of the framework with more governing rules around maladaptation and do no significant harm, an updated version of the climate bonds resilience methodology, so the methodological approach to it, so the governing framework. And then on the other hand, on the other side, we're also going to issue an updated version of the spreadsheet, which will probably become a lot more usable following some tweaks and changes that we provided. And this is going to happen within the next couple of months. So watch the space. In the future or during 2026, 26, 27, we are going to obviously populate the taxonomy with more criteria at the sector and subsector level. Water was just the beginning of the journey. We definitely are going to do buildings and probably agriculture, transport, ICT, and other sectors to basically provide more clarity around adaptation and resilience investments. And so populate the taxonomy, really. So having more technical working groups and industry working groups to really synthesize and distill that consensus, similar to obviously we did with water with John and Paul.
That's great. Thanks, Maria. So we do have a lot of exciting things that's coming up, and probably people will be knocking on your doors to ask, what exactly does this mean? Or what do we mean by the CBRT when we talk about sector-specific criteria? So I very much look forward to working together on this space. Thank you to John and Paul also for being here. I know you've spent years working in the space, so you've been a very, very important addition at Climate Bonds when we developed this criteria. So we do have 5 more minutes left, and there are a couple of questions in the chat that I would like either Paul or John or Mate, even if you want to jump in, please feel free to jump in, any of you. But so the first question is actually from Stephen, and he has asked, private investment in adaptation and water is suboptimal. Yet most measures and tracking of private investments in water or wastewater is nearly exclusively categorized as hard currency investments through PPP instruments. How can private finance be reframed as an opportunity for these domestic private capital market instruments, bonds, and bank debts with associated reduced forex risk exposure due to local currency revenue? Will this criteria help advance this? So I think what they're essentially also talking about is how can private finance or capital also help and mobilize capital for the water infrastructure, especially given the varying forex exchange rates happening and also with where the world is going. I think it's important also to understand from our side how our criteria can help mobilizing the capital.
Yeah, and obviously Stephen knows this space really well. So based on the nature of his question, if I go to I think his primary question of how can private finance be reframed as an opportunity for domestic private capital market instruments, bonds, and bank debt. I mean, I think that this is focused on bonds, right? And so I do think and hope that this provides just that reframing opportunity that he's calling for, right? That it's an opportunity to utilizing this criteria to devise, in effect, a financial instrument that can, the revenue from which can be directed towards credible and salient investments in resilience, right? And so that's really our hope. Matteo spoke earlier about the recognized need for the increase in the flow of capital towards adaptation and resilience. A secondary, or I'd say just as important component is ensuring that that flow is channeled towards what is credible and relevant. And that's really what we're trying to hope to do, right? Is to ensure that that flow, to the degree it is increased, goes towards what is needed and what is credible at the local scale.
Yeah. Thank you. That was very helpful, and also hope it answers his question. John, would you like to add something to that? Because we do have one more question, and I think it's an interesting one.
I think Paul gave a great answer.
Great, thank you. So the last question is, our scorecard uses a binary yes or no format across all our sections, with each section requiring a minimum of 60%. However, many criteria, such as we do ask questions like, are there arrangements in place to do this, or whether factors are considered, for example. So they rely heavily on verifier judgment with no defined evidentiary thresholds. So how do we ensure consistency across different verifiers, and what safeguards exist to prevent two competent assessors from reading this differently and the certification outcome differently?
It's a great question, and I think the way to start answering it is actually what do a lot of these what are investors actually reading often right now and in the past. The bond that I mentioned, the $100 million bond for this large urban utility, for instance, the memorandum of understanding for the issuance was about 100 pages long, single space type, and I found that the actual description of the project was around 5 brief paragraphs. And so investors are often making large decisions based on relatively limited information. And I think to use a word that Paul referenced a few minutes ago, investors are really looking for confidence, and I think that's what the certification process is important to. So if you are working through the criteria, you actually have to demonstrate evidence, either yes or no. And that's really important. It has to be documented, and that's something that can be independently audited as well. If an investor wants to go into that level of detail, they can see exactly why, for instance, they were like the issuer was able to answer a yes, and that's incredibly important. And I think Ashok is a very good colleague and friend of Paul and myself. It was a good question that he asked. Why that 60% threshold, I think, is also actually a really significant point. And we picked it a little bit arbitrarily 10 years ago, and we've received criticism both for and against 60%, that it's too ambitious and it's not ambitious enough. And I would like to think that maybe that's actually kind of like a good sign. It's a sweet spot, perhaps, that we're there, but we're also open to changing that. And the technical and industry working groups both largely endorse the current level of approval.
Great. Thanks, John. So I think we are at the end of the webinar. And for people who have attended, thank you so much for joining us. And of course, thank you, John, Paul, and Matteo for being here today. And John and Paul, the work you've done for our water criteria has been tremendous, very important, and also very exciting, because we did do a lot of these things together when it comes to adaptation and resilience. So for participants, please look at our public consultation form. We would love your feedback as much as we can get. And for people who I couldn't get back to the Q&A, apologies, because we did run out of time, but hopefully we will see you at another session. Thank you, everyone, and thank you to our panelists here today.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.